All right, everyone, we're back right before season three, episode five tonight. So I wanted to make a video on the major differences between Fire and Blood and House of the Dragon as of season three, episode four. So right before episode five premieres tonight. Um, so there are a lot of differences. So I try to just keep it to the five most significant differences. Um, Kind of ranked them from one to five in to in my viewpoint, in my opinion, what the most significant ones are. It is important to note that Fire and Blood is written from a Maester's perspective, and the Maesters tend to be a little more sympathetic with the Greens. So there could be some explanations why the show is valid in making these changes because the Maester would have had bias towards Team Green, and it was written from a Maester's perspective. There definitely have been some changes that I added in here that George has not liked, as in the author George R. R. Martin. He wrote a big like column, like a blog on like, for example, number two, which we're going to talk about in here, and like how he thinks that's going to create like a butterfly effect, and like it's going to create like downstream issues with the story. So I think they did even the producers and writers of this season kind of made some changes because they were like, wow, George is really pissed about that. But with that being said, let's get into number one major difference between Fire and Blood and House of the Dragon. All right, so the number one change I had is the Rhaena Nettles change. So in the show, Rhaena claims Sheep Stealer, but in the books, a young girl on Dragonstone, who we don't know if she's Targaryen or Valyrian, claims Sheep Stealer. They both claim Sheep Stealer by feeding him sheep, um, like have him like them, but obviously they just cut Nettles from the show and replaced her with Rhaena. Um, Nettles actually supported Team Black at the Battle of the Gullet with like Hugh was there on Vermithor and Ulf was there on Silverwing, so that's another change where in the show is just Jace, Rhaena, and Baela. Where in the show again, Baela actually indirectly kills Jace and burns Valyrian ships the Gullet. And Nettles claims Sheepstealer at the Red Sowing on Dragonstone, where Rhaena claims Sheepstealer in the Vale of Arryn. That was another thing that George did not like. George is like, dragons wouldn't just be by themselves in like another kingdom. They're like always on Dragonstone. So that was another critique George actually gave about the show. Um, I mean, I personally didn't like mind the sheep stealer being in the Val. I don't think it was like a ridiculous change, but I guess George was upset about it. But again, this was probably the most significant change because they just totally cut a pretty significant character from the books and just replaced her with Rhaena. And also, I don't want to get too spoilery here, but like basically in the books, like Daemon meets up with Nettles to try and find Aemon and Vhagar in the Riverlands, where I think Rhaena and Daemon are obviously going to do that. And another issue is at the end of the this story, basically like Rhaena claims, this is a spoiler, so if you don't want to hear it, skip ahead like 30 seconds, but like Rhaena claims a dragon called Morning that's hatched after the dance. So I don't know what they're going to do with that plot line towards the end of the show in season four, but they'll probably just end up cutting it. But this was definitely the most significant change, I would argue, from the books to the show. All right, number two. This was what I was alluding to about George being super upset. So they basically cut a character named Maelor, the second son, the third child of Aegon the second and Helena. And George like wrote a whole blog post about how this like could create a lot of like weird negative downstream effects to the story. Again, I don't want to get too spoilery, so I won't say too much. But yeah, George was super pissed off about this to say the least. So I think the writers and producers figured, we're just going to add Maylor in, and now we know for sure that Helena is pregnant. So most likely we will be expecting a boy named Maylor. I'm thinking we might see the birth in this episode, as in season three, episode five, but we shall see. Also, Maylor was at the Blood and Cheese event, so basically Helena had to like pick between Maelor and Jaehaerys, where she actually ultimately ended up picking Maelor over Jaehaerys, but then Blood was like, no, let's kill the older son. That'll affect them more. So basically, Maelor like is living and knowing that his mom like chose him to die over Jaehaerys. So that was like, I think, kind of a big event that they skipped out. I know one of my buddies, shout out to Jake. I know he was kind of annoyed with that change, how they just cut Malor from the Blood and Cheese event, because I do think it is a little more significant in terms of like, wow, Malor knows like that his like mom wanted him dead instead of Jaehaerys, which would definitely be like, even as a little kid, you'd remember that. Yeah, in the book, Malor was slaughtered with Sir Rickard Thorne at Bitterbridge in the Reach, where kind of like Darren is, and then Darren ends up burning down the whole castle and town of Bitterbridge, where the Caswells are from. Who we met, Lord Caswell. He got hung by Sir Otto at the end of season one. They're Team Black and Rhaenyra supporters, and basically, I think that's not a spoiler because on the show, I think they're gonna do something different with Malor's death, but he'll probably die. But we'll have to see. I do think that probably was the second most significant change. But let's go to number three. Okay, so number three is a little more broad. It's a little more general, but it's the overall characterization change of Rhaenyra and Alicent. So in the book, Alicent and Rhaenyra like despise one another. Where don't get me wrong, in the show there was a period from mid season one to like mid season two. They did like didn't like each other, but in the show it's much worse. The hatred goes is much deeper. Um, and in the show, they're much closer in age. Like they were more like friendly and friends in the show, but in the books, it's more of like a mom daughter stepdaughter relationship where Allison's like 10 to 11 years older than Rhaenyra. So they changed that, which definitely changed the whole dynamic of their their friendship. But I mean, I don't necessarily have an opinion on this. I do think they're making Alicent and Rhaenyra a little too like likable, where I think it's like one of them has to be more unlikable at least. I don't think it really makes sense for both of them to be like protagonists in a sense. Like in the books, Rhaenyra's like personality already starts to change a lot more at this point, and she's a lot more vindictive and manipulative and controlling and cruel. You could even argue, but in like the show, they're making her like a hero. And again, I'm not necessarily like opposed to that. I just think it's going so off of book canon that it's getting a little ridiculous. And again, the book is from the Maester's perspective, which is a Team Green supporting entity, so it does make sense a little bit. But I do think one of these characters has to start becoming, for a better word, a little more vindictive slash evil. I think both them being protagonists isn't super logical or honestly super interesting down the path, but we'll see. I mean, that might be a hot take. Some people might like this change, but another important note is in the book, Allison is sent to the dungeons when Rhaenyra captures King's Landing, begging for her son's life. So a fun little cool geography fact is Allison like asks Rhaenyra, she's like, "And how about you rule from King's Landing, like all the Crown lands, all the Riverlands, the Vale of Arryn, the North, and the Iron Islands, and then my son will rule the Stormlands, the Westerlands, and the Reach." And Rhaenyra's like, "No, like you've already tricked me enough and manipulated me enough." And then she sends Allison to the dungeon. So again, in the books, the relationship is a lot more hard, a lot more intense. They're much more cruel to each other. They definitely despise each other in the books, where in the show it's quite different. Alicent is basically on Team Black and helping Rhaenyra at this point. So again, whatever you think of that change, it is what it is, but I wouldn't say I'm necessarily a huge fan of it. But let's move on to number four. Okay, so number four is the Reach campaign and the overall Ormond and Darren dynamic slash personality tweaks. So in the book, the campaign in the Reach is like much more detailed and drawn out. In the show, they literally like Maester Orwyle mentions once there's like civil war in the Reach, but like in season two, they probably should have shown us a little bit more of this, in my opinion, because there was a lot of Team Rhaenyra supporters in the Reach, like the Castains, the Tarleys, like Sam Tarley's family, the Rowans of Golden Grove, um, who the Beesberries, the Caswells of Bitterbridge, the Footleys of Tumbleton. There was a lot more, like the Reach was a lot more divided, and I don't think in the show they did a great job at like portraying that. They just said it in like one line, and I get it to an extent, but maybe they could have highlighted that a little bit more in the show. I think in the campaign is really interesting, and basically Darren flies onto Sarion and like blows up Honeyholt, the castle of the Beesberries, which would have been kind of cool to see, but it is what it is. Yeah, like in the show, we just see the Green Army near Tumbleton, bending the knee to Damon in that scene at the beginning of season three, episode three, where he basically tricks him into giving the fake Darren. But that's really all we see on their campaign. Oh, also in the books, in the show, they mention that Ormond has like a weird sense of smell, which I think could be an interesting, like they do something with that, like Team Black and uses that to their advantage, but they don't mention that in the books at all. In the book, Ormond and Darren, like it's not really spelled out or written like very clearly, but they don't seem to have like a very like toxic relationship like they do in the show, where like Ormond is extremely manipulative and fairly cruel to Darren in a sense. Also in the book, they never mention about like Darren becoming like king, as in like Ormond wanting Darren to become king, especially at this point. I think it might be illuminated to alluded to later in the books, but definitely not at this time period. So there's definitely some pretty big changes around the whole Reach campaign and the dynamic between Ormond and Darren. Okay, so probably the least significant change is the whole Aegon and Laris change. So in the book, we just hear that Aegon and Laris basically fled to Bravos and just like hide out there for about a half a year. But in the show, obviously, they're extending this. They're putting a lot more information, which makes sense. I think this is a good change because in the books, you don't really like hear anything about Aegon and Laris for like probably 15 to 20 pages. Like they're just chilling in Bravo. So I do think the show is doing a good job, especially at expanding on Aegon's character and like now that he's almost seen as like a peasant and like a lower class individual, like this could change him, see what happens. Don't want to spoil anything. You also don't get to see the dying Sunfire at Rook's Rest and like Aegon like holding him, which I thought was a really good scene actually. Um, and who knows, maybe Sunfire's alive. I think you guys all know my opinion on that. But they're definitely giving us a lot more detail, which I definitely like overall. I think this was a good change because like we basically wouldn't see Aegon for like half a season if they like according to the books. So definitely a good change, and I'm really excited to see where this plot line goes. But with that being said, those are probably the top five most significant changes I thought in the um, from the book to the show. I mean, let me know your opinions in the comments. I could have missed, a few, but this was my top five. And again, there were a lot of changes, some good, some bad. Again, TV shows are always going to have to alter it somewhat significantly from a book, so you can't be too upset. I'd say overall the season's been pretty good, and even though they're making changes, I do think some have been good. So I can't, totally knock the bad ones. Um, but yeah, that's about it for today, guys. I'm looking forward to episode 5 tonight. Please like and subscribe if you can, and we'll see you next week.